Hello, web design students. Now let's get into interaction on the web. Let's talk about the HTML version of interaction on the web. And that means forms. So you've all filled out a form on the web in your lives, maybe even today. So the form in HTML starts with the form tag, of course. And then we talk about a method. So a method is either two choices, post or get. Method post is best for when users are adding to or deleting information from a database, or uploading a file, or entering sensitive data like a password. Method get is best for when you're retrieving data from the web, like using Google, so pulling down results from Google instead of adding information up, like uploading a file or signing up for a service where you enter some information like your name and address and such. So there's get and post. Then there's action, which contains the URL for the page on the server that receives the submitted information. So what happens when you fill out a form, something like PHP kind of file will take this information and put it in a way that someone can use it on the other end. So while we don't have anything to do this action for us right now, I can show you something that can be a stopgap in the meantime. Otherwise, you'd use something with PHP, and we're not going to get into this course. That's in a different course, but I'll show you something you can use in the meantime anyway. So for now, we'll use hashtag in this spot. ID is used to identify the form distinctly from other elements so that scripts, usually JavaScript, can target it specifically. Now, we've used class before, we've used ID before. This ID has to be different than all the other IDs in the page, just like every other ID. Has to be different each time. So here's 3 ports: method, action, and ID that go into the form opening tag. Now we can get into stuff you actually type into a form. So input, these are like the spaces that we use to interact with this form. So if we want to enter some kind of text, we can use input type text. And then we always want to have the name of the actual piece of information. So in this case, this is a field for the first name that we enter into a form. And we'll put name first underscore name so that when all this information gets sent to a machine, we can see that whatever was typed in is associated with this identifier. And then we have a label to actually tell the person that's entering the information what they're actually entering. So here we've got a label tag, then a break tag to move to the next line. And then in the next line, we have input type and name, first name. So what this looks like, first name, the label, and then a field where you can type in information. Other types of input include radio buttons. So a radio button is where you have different choices and you can only select one at a time. So this is what that kind of entry input looks like. Input type radio, they all have a name. So they all have the same name, title, because these are all types of titles. And then the value is different. So there's Mr., there's Mrs., there's Miss. So when this information gets sent to a PHP file or some other thing in the web, whatever was selected, that value will show up and then the name will show up so they'll know what kind of value it is. Because by itself, you're not really sure what this is. So you have to have the name that goes with it. So for each of these 3 choices, the name is the same, but the value is different. Input type password is for when we're entering passwords. And browsers will automatically hide the password as you type it into the box. You'll see sometimes there's an option to click and then you can see the password, but without that, you just type the password in and it hides automatically through the browser. Using the select tag plus the option tag, you can make drop-down menus. So all of these together fit in the select tag, and then each of the options gets its own option tag. So for label country, we have a drop-down selection, and then we have 5 separate options. And this is what it looks like in the browser. You see this double arrow or some kind of arrow symbol that indicates that you can drop down and select from more than one option. And this is what you see when you click on the drop down. So you see all the options that you had typed in your HTML. Another kind of form input is checkbox. So here is a checkbox. All of this is put into the label. So you can include input types inside the label, and this is what it looks like. So within this entire label, you can have an input type of checkbox with a value. Now, instead of using name, we use value. And then you can give it a name. You can call it something when you assign a value to it. And then here's some regular text and then a link. And then all of that put together makes this. And this is your end result. You click this. If you want to, you can click the terms and conditions and go to another page. But here is all of that information included within the label. So instead of name, we use value for type checkbox. And then all put together, you have this. Now there's 2 ways to handle buttons. So the first way is to use the button tag itself. So you can use button and then sign up, or you can do button with type reset that makes a special kind of button that you can reset a form, and this is what that looks like. So click the sign up, or if you want to start over, click reset form, and then the browser will empty all the fields and you can start over. That's the first way to do a button. Again, button tag. The other way is to use type submit. And then instead of a name, you put a value. So this value gets entered into the actual button. This is the type, this is the text that shows up in the button when you use input type submit. So all of this together, here's a quick form. We don't have an action. Our method is get, and then we have labels. Here's a for get name. We haven't talked about that yet, but put that in that you can use that. ID here, type and name. And then here's the button. So there's 3 pieces to this. And then this is the result. Here's piece number 1, the name. Then there's the field, that's the input type text. And then the button, input type submit. And then here's the save. This was the information that we put in the value. So all of that makes this. So if you click on this button, it'll submit the form. You may have noticed in some forms to be filled out the required fields. This is how you make required. You add it as an attribute within input type. So in this case, entering an email address is required because this attribute's here. Then if you don't fill out the field that's required, you click maybe sign up, you'll get a little warning that says you have to fill out this field before you can proceed. Other types of form inputs, text area, also have name. So this gives the user a box you can type text in. And so you've seen this before. There'll be these 2 lines here, and you can resize the box if needed. And there are all sorts of other options like key generator, legend. Legend makes a box around the form if you want to have extra style to it. There's all sorts of other things you can do with forms, but these are the ones that I just talked about that are most common. So let's make an easy form. So back to our mockup. If you remember in our mockup, my mockup, at the bottom, near the bottom, I had a newsletter sign up form. So we're going to build this in our example website. So if we scroll down, I had made a div for newsletter. Way down here we go. And now we can start to build our form. Of course, we start with form, and then our method in this case will be post. Our action, we don't have an action at the moment, so we can just leave a # there. ID, let's call this subscribe. Have to have an ID. Don't forget the closing tag. And now we can start to put our inputs. But before we put our inputs, remember we have some text here. Now in our form, we could put any text we want. In this case, I'll use an H2, do newsletter, sign up. And then we can start to put some inputs. Our first input, type email. Have to have a name, of course. So I'll just call this email as well. And then the next thing we want is a button. So I'm going to use the input type version of button. Input type submit. And then the value of my input type, we'll call it submit. And that's a form. So if we save this, go back to our browser. So we go back to our browser, open up our browser, and here is our form. Doesn't look like much yet, but we can style this up a little bit. So to do that, back to our code. Now we can add classes to all of these things. So let's start with our input type, email, class equals, let's call it email box. And then in our input type submit, we can also give that a class. We'll call this submit button. So we've added a class to email, our email input type. We've added a class to our submit button, so we can add some specific style to these two pieces. So in our CSS, we can start to add style to those form pieces. So I'll just scroll down before our media queries, and then we'll start to style our form. We'll put the form tag, curly brackets. First, I want to establish the width of my form. So I'm going to consider this part my form, and then the rest of it is the newsletter div. So let's just concentrate on this part right here. Back to our code. Let's just call it a width of 65%, let's guess. And then do a padding, do 2% on all sides. So back to our code in our browser, 3, 2, 1, refresh. Now we've got a little bit more space around the pieces of the form. So let's start to do some more stuff. Let's do some more stuff in our mockup. Our form's in the middle, so we can move our form to the middle using margin 0 auto. So if we save this back to our browser, 3, 2, 1, refresh. Now our form is sort of in the middle. We can start to make more style changes to make this more look like our mockup. So next thing you want to do, before we do anything else, let's just give it a background color so we can see what this looks like. Let's just call it orange. To our browser, 3, 2, 1, refresh. And now we have an orange background in our form part. The newsletter div part surrounds it. So we'll add some style for that also, but we at least establish this part of our form in our browser. So we still need to do a little more styling here. And maybe we need to adjust this width. But for now, let's move on to our newsletter div. Just to differentiate our newsletter div and our form, I'll give this a different color. Eventually, I'll replace this with a background image. My mockup has a background image here. We'll change that later on. But let's establish a background color so we can tell the difference. To our code. 3, 2, 1, refresh. Now we have what represents our newsletter div in cyan and our form in orange. So now we can do a little more styling to get this closer to our mockup. Mockup like this. Start to add a little more to these fields and this button. Back to our code. Here, now we used email box. And we also had submit button classes. So we're going to apply style to those. First, let's deal with the email box. Let's look at our mockup. So this had a little more width than our standard current field here. So we can go back to our browser, go to email box and apply some padding to it. Let's go 2% like milk. And we'll do a width. Let's call it 65% again. We're going to experiment maybe a little with this. And then we want to move the email field and the button further apart. So we can add a margin right to it. Let's say 5%. So if we save this, go back to our browser, 3, 2, 1, refresh. And we got a nice big field. It looks a little better. Got a little space here and comes some space in between the field and the button. Now let's work on this button. Padding 2% again, that seemed to work well. I like 2% milk. And width, let's give it a bigger width. Not so much like the last time, like 65%. Let's do like 15. Save this, then refresh. Now our button's a little bigger. It looks a little nicer. So this is closer to what we want. Now, in my mockup, I should probably have put something saying here like, please enter your email address. So we can go back in our code in our HTML and add that. So we can use it as a label. So insert it in here between the heading and the actual input types. Let's do label, and then please enter your email address. So if I save this here, go back to the browser, 3, 2, 1, refresh. Now I have a nice little label that goes along with our form here. Let's go back to our form for a second. Right now, we don't have anything here, so this form won't work when you enter your email address and click the button. There is something that I found that you could use until you have your own PHP scripts and things like that. I found it at simple-form.com. So what they do is they let you create a form. So we already created a form with method post. That's what we did. And then replace the following URL in the action attribute. So they say, hey, use simple-form.com and then your own email address and form so that when someone fills out the form, you get sent an email with that data. So I'm not going to actually do it. You can do this if you like, but what they say to do is copy this, paste it here, and then change this to your email address. So in my case, I would put my email address at jefferson.edu. And then this would be a functioning form. Here's a quick note in Atom. If you want this to wrap, click View and then toggle Soft Wrap, and then everything will fit. Whoops. Everything will fit in your browser screen right here. So you can see everything all at once. One more thing we can do is maybe I want to have this a little bit taller. So this is kind of scrunched. Our mockup will have a little space above and below the actual form. So we can change the size or the height of these elements here. So let's go back to our browser, or let's go back to our code. And in style.css, let's go to our newsletter div. We want to add a little more space on either side, top and bottom of our form. So we'll use height. And this is going to be something we haven't seen before, but there is a unit of measurement called viewport height and width. So that works as 100 viewport height is the height of the entire viewport or the browser window. So it goes from 0 to 100. You can also do viewport width if you were doing a width, not for a height. So let's just say, let's do 25 viewport height. And then let's go to our browser. 3, 2, 1, refresh. And now our viewport or our newsletter div is now 25% of the viewport height. So here's 25. We haven't put a height on this yet. So this is getting closer to our mockup. Now, I don't have a background image yet. I'll bring that in later. But this is a good stopping point because in order to get this centered from top to bottom here, I'm going to use something next week called Flexbox. But for right now, I'm going to leave it here as this is, and then we'll finish styling this up next week. So just to sum up, in our index file, in our newsletter div, we wrote a form using method post action. We use simpleform.com as an example, an ID, and then actual text. Here's a heading, and then here's a label, a little bit of instructions for our user, and then our input type. So this is a field to enter their email address. And then here was a button called input type submit. And the value, the actual word in the button is submit. So whatever you type in here shows up in the button. And then it had a class. And then this input type also had a class. And then in our style CSS file, we styled out the form a little bit. Had width of 65%, padding 2% around, margin auto to center it, and then a quick background color just to be able to see it on the page. And then our newsletter div that surrounded it has a background color of cyan and a height of 25 viewport height. So 25% of the viewport at any moment will be the height that's shown in our browser. And then we had some extra style for our input field where the email address gets typed in, a little bit of padding, a little bit of width, and then a little margin right to move it over, move the button over. And then the submit button had a little bit of extra padding and then a width of 50% of itself. And then this was our end result. So next week, we will get this in the middle, and then I'll put back the, I'll style this up to make it more looking like our mock-up here. So that's an HTML form.